What's up, everybody? Welcome to System Crafters. I'm David Wilson, and today we're going to talk about how you can build a personal knowledge base, or you might think of it as a second brain, in Emacs with a package called org-roam. So before we can talk about org-roam, we should talk about org mode. So org mode is known to be a great tool for not just writing and taking personal notes, but also for time tracking, personal planning, to-do lists, and a lot more. If you've ever used org mode and got really into it, then you probably know what I'm talking about. So once you start to become really invested in org mode, you'll eventually have to come up with a system for managing your org files so that it's easy to store and find the information that you need. So org-roam is an extension to org mode, which solves a couple of the biggest problems that I've personally had when using org mode for personal notes. And that's how many org files do I need? And also, how do I decide where to put things in all of these org files that I've created? So org-roam solves these problems by making it easy to create topic-focused org files and link them together so that you can treat the information as nodes in a network rather than hierarchical documents. So whenever you start using org mode a lot and you try to organize your information in org mode, you'll end up creating a bunch of org files that have a whole lot of headings and even nested subheadings. And a lot of it is sort of to capture information that you're trying to remember, or maybe projects that you're trying to plan. And it kind of becomes unwieldy over time, and it's hard to decide how to split all this information up. So org-roam gives us some strategies and some tools to deal with that. So you can actually think of this as a personal wiki. It actually does function a lot like a wiki, but it does have some extra functionality above that. So it's inspired by a program called Roam and a note-taking strategy called Zettelkasten, where the goal is to create many individual single-topic notes that are linked together to create a networked knowledge base. And if you've heard of the term Zettelkasten before, maybe you've looked into it a little bit, maybe you haven't, you don't really need to understand what that means or really study it before you can actually use org-roam in a productive and useful way. I really haven't studied Zettelkasten very much, but I understand the core concepts of why you want to do it like that, and I've been able to do just fine with org-roam, making my own personal knowledge base. All right, so many people consider this like creating a second brain because it can easily handle a huge amount of knowledge and also remind you of connections between those topics very effectively. And once you start to build up your personal knowledge base, you will see it over time how that actually comes to play. The major advantage of org-roam over other similar note-taking tools is that you get to use all of the other great features of org mode along with this new way of organizing your org files and your information. So we're going to do more videos in a series about org-roam where we talk about how to bring in all of the other org mode features into a workflow using org-roam. But for now, we're just going to talk about how to set up org-roam and the basics for how to use it and how to think about the model for using org-roam. Okay, so if you have not followed org-roam at all up until now, I'll tell you that there was a previous version of org-roam that people had been using for a year or two, and then very recently, within the last couple of weeks as of the recording of this video, a version 2 came out, and the prerequisites for V2 are different now than what they were in V1, as far as I understand. And V2 depends on a customized build of the SQLite database tool to operate. And org-roam will actually take care of compiling the code for that program for you as long as you have a compatible compiler installed. So on Linux and Mac OS, you just need to make sure you have a C++ compiler like GCC or Clang, and you can usually install that from the package manager for your Linux distribution or using Homebrew or other tools like that on Mac OS. On Windows, you will need to follow the instructions that are in the org-roam manual. If you follow the link in the show notes, in the description below to the show notes, you can find the link there. But basically, the idea is that you need to install the MSys2 tool on Windows and then install GCC through that, and then org-roam should be able to compile this program. And you may be wondering why org-roam needs a database. Well, the database enables org-roam to keep track of all the nodes that you create and the links between those nodes very efficiently. So it's better than your Emacs Lisp code and Emacs having to go parse all these things and store them in an Emacs Lisp file somehow. If you use an actual database locally, then it makes all this a lot more efficient. And the upside of that is that you actually have access to that database as well to write extensions on top of org roam, which could be a very interesting thing to do. And we'll talk about that in a later video. Not really going to get into that right now, but it's something that you should keep in mind in case you have need for more advanced searching over your org files. Okay, so to install org roam, you will just basically install it from Melpa using package.el, straight.el, or whatever it is that you use for installing packages in your Emacs configuration. If you use package with package.el, you can just copy this short little invocation here to install and load org roam for the first time. This is not the way that we're going to configure it, but we're just going to use this to actually do the initial installation process and to invoke the compilation of that Emacs SQLite component that we need to have installed. So I'm going to pop over to a separate Emacs configuration here, and then I will run this configuration to install org roam and then to cause that other package to be compiled. So I've already got org roam installed right now, but you can see in the echo area that it is saying that it's compiling the Emacs SQLite binary. This will take maybe 5 to 10 seconds depending on how fast your computer is. But once that's done, org roam should be able to load, and you'll be able to check to see whether the SQLite binary is available to it by checking a specific variable. And we'll give it just a second, and we can try that out. So the variable I'm talking about is the org roam -- SQLite available p variable, and that basically is an internal variable for org roam to say, okay, we've actually found that the SQLite component is available, and we can proceed. So a little window has popped up here. I'll talk about that in a second, but before that, I'm just going to check this org roam SQLite available p variable, and we can see that the value is t, so it seems that it has compiled successfully and it is available to org roam to be used. So now, once we loaded org roam for the first time, we got this window that popped up. It's the warnings buffer, and it gives us information saying that we're now on org roam v2. So since there was just a transition between org roam v1 and v2, there has been some changes to the overall framework of org roam and also to the database that it stores. And if you have been using org roam v1 before, you'll have to run the command and the instructions here to update all of your org roam files to v2. However, if you've never used org roam before, you don't have to worry about this. The reason why they're doing this is because a lot of people would be affected by this upgrade, and they wanted to make sure that everybody knew what to do if they did have to upgrade. But if this is your first time, you don't have to worry about that. So the thing you need to do to make this message go away, either if you have never used org roam v1 before, or if you've used org roam v1 and you've followed the instructions to upgrade, is to set a particular variable to make that go away. And let's see, did I set that here? I think I must have set it in a later slide. But we'll talk about that in a minute so that you can see how to make that message finally go away. So after we finally got org roam installed, the most important thing to configure is the folder where your org roam files will be located. So by default, this is going to be a folder called org roam in your home directory, but you'll probably want to set this as something else. And no matter what path that you use, I definitely recommend creating that folder in advance before you tell org roam to use it, because the first note that you create in org roam might not actually be created correctly. So it's better to just double check that that folder exists before you start using that. So, and one other important tip, don't use your existing folder full of org files if you have one. Like if you've been using org mode for a long time and you have a folder full of org mode files, don't use that as a folder for org roam, because those files don't have the necessary metadata inside, and org roam won't be able to process them correctly. So it's better to create a new folder fresh, and then if you want to migrate over some of the stuff from your old org notes, you should create new nodes in org roam and copy that information over. So it's just a kind of a best practice there. So we'll also set up some key bindings that are really necessary to use this effectively, and then we will call org roam setup to make sure everything's ready to go. It basically just sets up some hooks and makes sure that the database can be updated anytime we edit one of the org roam node files. So this is the more useful configuration for org roam here. We're going to copy it over and I'll tell you what those things do. So let me just drop this in. So now we are setting the org roam directory. I'm setting it to a folder called roam notes in my home folder. However, you should set it to whatever you feel most comfortable with, wherever you like to put your notes. So this is just an example we're using for the sake of this video. We're also setting up 3 bindings, which we'll talk about in a little while. And we also have this org roam setup call that I mentioned before. So like I said, we need to make sure that this Rome notes directory exists before we proceed. So I'm going to jump into eShell really quickly and try to make that directory. So Rome notes. Okay, so I think that one should be empty. Yep, there's nothing there already. So now I'll go back to init.el and I will execute this configuration using Control-X, Control-E. And now we should have everything set up correctly so that org will use the Rome notes folder for storing our new notes. So now, okay, so apparently the migration warnings section was here. So as I mentioned before, that migration warnings dialog will always pop up until you set a particular variable to suppress it. So in this configuration we just copied, we need to take this variable set for org rome v2 ac and set it to true, but we need to do it in the init section of use package, which comes before the org rome package gets loaded, because what's happening here is that when org rome gets loaded, if that variable is not set, it shows that the warning message. So to prevent that from happening, we need to make sure we copy these two lines over into our config so that we don't see those again in the future. So basically, if I were to restart Emacs right now and load this config again, we wouldn't see that warning anymore. All right, so now that we got everything set up, we've got org rome installed correctly, we've got the basic configuration set, now we can finally create our first node in org rome. So to do that, we can use the Control-C nf binding that we have just configured to invoke the org rome node find command, which brings up a completion session to select or create a node. And since we want to create a node, we have to type in a name of a node that doesn't exist yet. And let's say we want to create a node called programming languages. So I'll hop over to this config, Control-C nf, and you can see down here the keycast is telling us that I put that key binding in. In the mini buffer is asking us for a node name. We don't see any other nodes because we haven't created any yet. So I'm going to type in programming languages here and press enter. And now we see a window pop up, but it's not just a normal file. It's actually an org mode capture buffer. So the reason this happens is because org rome uses org capture templates as a way to give the default templates for new nodes, but you can also add additional capture templates if you have different types of nodes that you like to create for your workflow. So by default, it's just a plain org file that has some metadata at the top, which is necessary for org rome, and also the title of the node that we just created, and then everything else is open to us to just put whatever information in that we'd like. But before this node actually fully exists, we have to press Control-C, Control-C, as mentioned here in the header line, so that the capture buffer, which you can see the file here has capture dash at the front, we want to make sure that it gets stored as a real file before it actually gets stored into the org rome database. So I'm just going to add a little line of text here. I'll say, here are some great programming languages. And I'll use Control-C, Control-C to finish this node. And now we see that the capture at the beginning of the file name has gone away now because this file is now saved. And we have the file contents that we have created there. And we're ready to go. We have our first node. Now, if I were to press Control-C nf again, you can see that we have our one node programming languages that shows up here now. And any more nodes that we create in org rome will show up as nodes in this list. And if you have a good completion framework, like let's say Helm, Ivy, Selectrum, Vertigo, etc., and any of the built-in ones in Emacs, I suppose, it will be very easy for you to find which node that you're looking for. So this is where org rome becomes useful compared to what you might have been doing before. You don't have to figure out which file you're looking for. You don't have to use find file and go, navigate your file hierarchy to find the files. You just press this Control-C nf key binding, and then you can just type in the name of the topic or the node that you're looking for and press enter, and then you're in the file. So that makes things a lot more efficient from that perspective. All right, let's see what else here. So now let's create another node called Emacs Lisp because we want to start building out our personal knowledge base about programming languages. So I'll use the same binding, Control-C nf. I'll type in Emacs Lisp, press enter. It pulls up the capture buffer. Since I don't need to add any other information to this right now, I'm just going to press Control-C, Control-C, and now that node has been created. If I press Control-C nf again, we can see now we have programming languages and Emacs Lisp as the two nodes that are in our org rome database. So the interesting thing to note here, which I don't know if you noticed it yet, but these are just plain org files. They're not anything special. They have a little bit of extra metadata on them. As you can see, there's this properties section at the top, but aside from that, they're plain org mode files, which means that you can check them into a Git repository. You can sync them across your machines using whatever tool you like to sync, like SyncThing or Unison or whatever you like, rsync. So you can just sync those plain text files. And the important thing is that you don't actually have to sync org roam's own database. Any machine that you pull up these files on using org roam, it will rebuild the database using the exact files that you already have in your folder. So that database file does not need to be synced. That's a very useful thing actually, because now you can just treat these like normal text files and nothing special, and then everything works across multiple machines. All right, so the real power of org roam begins when you start linking your node files together. However, this is a bit different than how you would normally link together org files or add links in org files. Normally you would use, let's see, Control-C, Control-L, I believe is the key binding for that. That is the org insert link command. You don't use that for org roam. You can use org insert link to insert links to websites and other things like that. But if you want to make links between org roam nodes, there is a different binding and command for that. And that is the Control-C ni binding for insert, and the command is org roam node insert. And that's going to bring up a completion list containing all of the nodes that you've created so far. And if you select one of those nodes, it's going to create a link inside of the current buffer, the current org roam node buffer for that other node. So if we were to go into the programming languages file and then use Control-C ni, we're going to get the listing of our nodes here in the mini buffer area. If I select Emacs Lisp, then we have a link to Emacs Lisp here. And I think if I click on that, it will navigate to the Emacs Lisp file. And I can jump back to the other file. And if you take a look at the actual link here, it's actually an ID-based link. So this is one of those sort of features of org roam that might be a little bit different than what you're used to. All the links are based on org IDs and not on file paths. So keep that in mind whenever you're trying to use this. All right, so now we have two nodes and they're linked together, which is a good start. So we can also type the name of a node that doesn't exist yet when we're trying to insert a node, and that node will be created. And this is a very efficient way to start building out your knowledge graph as you are writing in a certain topic area. So if you're writing in a particular topic like programming languages and you're like, okay, well, I want to talk about, Emacs Lisp and Scheme and some other languages, you don't have to go and individually create each one of those files. You can actually use the insert command to speed up that process in line in the current file that you are editing. So let's say I want to start a new line here, and instead of going and manually creating a new node for the Scheme language, I use Control-C ni to do insert and type in Scheme here, and we're typing in the name of a node that does not exist yet. I press enter, and now we get a capture buffer for creating this node. And I don't really have anything to say for this yet, so I'll just press Control-C, Control-C, and then immediately after I confirm that capture buffer and that node gets created, the link to that node will be inserted. So this makes it a lot faster to start creating new nodes related to the current node. And yeah, so that's how you create nodes that don't exist yet. I use this all the time. Unfortunately, there was an even faster way to do this in org roam v1. I think they've removed it in v2, but hopefully they'll bring it back a little bit later. It was called org roam find file immediately or something like that. It was sort of this immediately concept, which basically just created the new file without even having to prompt you and then insert the link directly. But maybe they'll add it back, or maybe the community will add that function in a separate package or something. We'll see how it goes. All right, so another way that you might want to insert links to other nodes is using completions. So you can use the built-in completion at point functionality in Emacs to complete the names of nodes that are inside of the double square brackets. So the way that link syntax works in org mode in general is that you have links inside of double brackets. So if I were to go and press delete or backspace at the end of this line, you can see that this link starts with two brackets and then has the information about the target of the link and then the title for the link inside of it. So if you were to go and manually type in open square bracket, close square bracket twice, so that you have two brackets on the left, two brackets on the right, then you can use metax and run completion at point. And now you will get a completion list for all the nodes that you have. And if you select one of these, like let's say Emacs Lisp, it turns it into a link to the Emacs Lisp node. And you'll see here that it starts off with a link that has this Rome colon syntax. But if you save the buffer, it will change that back to the normal name of the node so that you don't see those Rome colons everywhere in your file. So this may not seem super convenient because the other key binding is actually a little bit faster than doing this using Control-C-N-I. However, there is a different way to do completions in buffers that might be a little bit more convenient for you. And that is to turn on this functionality for completion everywhere. And that's the org roam completion everywhere variable. Setting that to T makes it so that anywhere in a buffer, if you start typing a couple of characters and then use completion at point, it will try to complete whatever you've been typing as a node name so that you can insert a link to that node inside the current buffer. I don't think this allows you to create new nodes. It just allows you to select an existing node. So what we're going to do is take this updated configuration. There's two things we're doing differently here. One of them is that in the custom section, we're setting this org roam completion everywhere to true. And we're also adding an additional binding into the org mode map. So in every org mode file, we're adding a new key binding for completion at point. And we're using the traditional binding for this in Emacs, which is Control-Alt-I or Control-Meta-I. So what I'll do is go copy and paste this updated configuration back into our init.el file. Let me just drop that in and I can delete the stuff that we had added before and then go in here and hold Control-Alt-X to execute this. Now I can go back into programming languages. I can type in EM and then Control-Alt-I, and then that will automatically complete that to Emacs Lisp because that's the only completion that starts with EM. So if we had other items that started with the same letter and you only typed in that same letter or prefix, then you would get a selection list to say which one you actually wanted to insert for. So if you are doing some writing, it could be useful for, like, let's say I like the languages EM and SC, and then basically you very quickly get the, well, that's interesting that the extra period showed up there. You very quickly get the nodes that you want to link into the document inserted very quickly without having to use other key bindings. So that could be a lot faster. You could also bind that to tab. However, tab has a special meaning in org mode buffers, and it's not very good to try to rebind tab to something else because you'll break cycling of headings. So that's why we stick with Control-Alt-I in org mode buffers. Okay, so there's a new feature in org v2 that did not previously exist, or at least as far as I know, in org v1, which is that you could also turn a top-level heading inside of an org roam file into its own node that is sort of its standalone topic. And probably you would only want to do this if there was a topic that was really so small or insignificant that you didn't want to create a separate file for it. You can actually just create a heading inside of your file to do that instead. So to do this, what you need to do is create a top-level heading inside of an org roam node buffer, and then use the org ID get create command to assign an ID to that header. And once you do that, then org roam will pick that up and then turn that into its own node. So let's go into the Emacs Lisp node. Emacs Lisp. Oops. I'll use Control-C and F. Whoops. Sorry. Control-C and F. Emacs Lisp, and then I'm going to create a heading called resources, let's say for, like, tutorials, links, etc. Then I'm going to use that org ID get create function or command, and all it does is just create an ID for this node, for this heading, and then assign it. And as soon as I save this file, I can use Control-C and F, and now we see that resources is a part of this list. So whatever you name that node is going to show up now inside of the node list. So what happens if you have the same top-level nodes in multiple files? So let's say for every single programming language node that I have, like let's say for both Emacs Lisp and for Scheme, if I have a resources node that I want to turn into, or a resources heading that I want to turn into a node, what happens if I do that? Well, let's try it. I'm going to go into the CNF Scheme node. I will create a resources heading. And then I will use org ID get create to turn that into a node. I'll use Control-C and F, and now we see there are two resources entries, and those actually correspond to the headings in both of those files. To org roam, these are independent nodes, even though they have the same name, because really the uniqueness is driven by the ID of the node and not the name itself. So what do you do in that case? You can't tell those two apart. You would have to navigate to both of those to figure out which one you were actually trying to find. And that's not really effective for what we're trying to do here. We're really trying to make it more efficient to find information that we're looking for. So if you happen to get yourself in this situation, you can actually create an alias for any node, whether it's a file node or a heading node, by using the org roam alias add command. So as long as your cursor is inside of a known node, like in this case, the resources node, you can use the org roam alias add command to add an alias. So in this case, I want to call this scheme resources instead. So once I do that, I can save that file, and the title of this file does not change. However, if you go look at the properties section at the top, well, it's supposed to have added, oh, I'm sorry, no, wrong place. If you look in the properties section of this node, you can see that we have a new item called roam aliases that has scheme resources in it. And if we use Control C and F, we can see now that those two resources entries are still there, but we have a new entry for scheme resources. So you could get to the same node using the right entry for resources, or by using scheme resources as a different name for that same node. And you're not limited to only one alias. You can add another alias as well. So let's say I'll add another alias for scheme links. So now you see we have two roam aliases, and if I use Control C and F, we have scheme links, scheme resources, and then the same two resources entries as before. So this is just if you want to get yourself out of trouble, if you have sort of some problems with the way you have things organized. Personally, I feel like you probably should never get yourself into this problem to begin with. Like if you're organizing things correctly, hopefully you would never have to do this. If you have a bunch of headings with the same name that you're turning into nodes, maybe you should consider creating separate topic entries for those instead. Because the idea with org roam and even with zettelkasten, etc., is that you're trying to create smaller topic nodes rather than having one huge document with a lot of headings that you also turn into nodes. So I'm not really sure what the most effective use case is for using heading nodes, especially whenever you have this type of problem. But if you find a way to use it that you like, definitely let me know in the comments, because I would be very interested to find out. Okay, so once you've started creating a lot of nodes that are linked together, it might be very helpful to open the backlinks buffer to see which nodes are linked to the node that you're currently viewing. And this is actually one of the biggest selling points of org roam, is this ability, now that you have this network of nodes, you need to be able to see the relationships between them to actually get more value out of them. One of the things that people say whenever they talk about making this kind of knowledge base is that if you have a lot of notes on a particular topic, and you have a lot of connections to that topic from other notes, if you review your backlinks, you might start to see connections between topics that you hadn't really thought about before, and it might give you new ideas. So having your backlink buffer open while you're viewing your org roam files could actually be very helpful to you for your thinking and writing process. So let's open up the Emacs Lisp node and then press the Control C N L binding to show the buffer by using the org roam buffer toggle command. So let's go over to Emacs Lisp. Let me just use Control C N F for that, Emacs Lisp. And then I'm going to use Control C N L, and that pops up another window below with a buffer that has these entries here, basically, where both times that we mentioned Emacs Lisp, we're currently in the Emacs Lisp file here, and in the backlinks buffer below, which is the org roam buffer, anytime we mentioned Emacs Lisp or linked to Emacs Lisp from another mode, we're going to have an entry here. So since we mentioned Emacs Lisp twice in programming languages, it actually shows up twice for the programming languages node here. So what we see is that the programming languages node mentions Emacs Lisp and also gives basically an excerpt of the text in programming languages where Emacs Lisp was mentioned. So you kind of get a little bit of context about the reference between these two nodes. So if you switch to a different node, you'll actually get that updated. So now we're in the Emacs Lisp node. For some reason, it went away. Interesting. Let's close this really quickly and reopen it. Control C and L. Wow, that's interesting that actually cleared out. Let's switch to a different node and see what happens next. Control C and F. We're going to switch to Scheme. Okay, so now it actually did update correctly for Scheme. We see that the links to Scheme are here. Let's jump back to Emacs Lisp, and now Emacs Lisp is also select it again, and you would get the backlinks for that. So anytime you change to another node, this buffer will update. So you don't have to keep closing and reopening this buffer, aside from the fact of what we just saw there. I don't know why that happened. But if we were, like, let's say if we were to go to programming languages node, Control C and F, select programming languages. And now we see that programming languages is here, but it's empty because there's no other node that references programming languages. However, let's say we create Control C in F. I'm going to create a system crafters node. And here I'm going to say we sometimes make videos about let's just say PRO, programming languages like EM, Emacs Lisp, and SC, Scheme. And since we have multiple SC entries, this completion is giving me the choice of which one I want. I'm going to press Scheme here, and then I'm going to save that and hit Control C, and now we have an entry for System Crafters that links these 3 other nodes. And now if I go to the programming languages node, we can see that we have a link from System Crafters now. And if we go to the Emacs Lisp node, then we can see that, interestingly, this sometimes doesn't populate, but let me use Control C and F to get there. All right, so now we can see that the System Crafters link is referenced here as well in the backlinks for the Emacs Lisp node. So that just goes to show you that as you are creating new nodes and updating them, making changes, the database gets updated and the backlinks buffer will also be refreshed and show you the latest information there. There may be some issues here and there with how reliably that works, or it may just be something with my configuration, not sure. So let me know in the comments if you have trouble with this, and maybe file an issue on the Orgrom GitHub repository if you have further problems. All right, so I think that's it. So we've covered enough about Orgrom in this video so that you can start taking notes in a new way. And in my opinion, it's very satisfying to start building up your personal knowledge base using the tools that Orgrom provides. After I started to really understand Orgrom and started to build out my own set of nodes, I really did start to get a lot more value out of it because I had to think less about where I was putting information, because I just created smaller nodes to keep all that stuff. And it actually encouraged me to write notes about things that I wouldn't have been writing notes about before, about various different topics. Very helpful for storing links to resources about those things as well, which I do pretty commonly. So in future videos in this series about Orgrom, we're going to cover more topics like using capture templates to create Orgrom nodes. So like we've got this default template that doesn't really do much, but maybe we have other types of nodes we need to create that have more of a template to them for information that you want to fill in. Also, you can use Orgrom for daily journaling and logging with a feature called Dailies, which I use quite often actually. And then we can also do some work to populate the org agenda using your Orgrom files, and actually in a lot more efficient way than you would do with plain org files. So keep an eye out for that. And we'll also talk about whatever else that shows up as Orgrom v2 develops, because Orgrom v2 is really meant to be a platform on which other packages will be developed. So we'll be talking about that over time as we see new things that come up. And if you find anything interesting about Orgrom that we haven't covered here, definitely please leave a note in the comments and let me know about it, because I keep an eye on things, but I can't find everything. So in the meantime, check out the Orgrom manual for more information on the features that Orgrom provides, and you might learn some cool new things there until we get to the next videos. And also make sure to subscribe just to make sure that you get notified whenever we make these new videos. I have to, I'm not a YouTuber unless I say subscribe to the channel at the end of the video, so sorry for that. All right, so before we go, I want to say thank you to, to my sponsors. These people have decided to sponsor the work that I'm doing, making videos about GNU Geeks, GNU Emacs, etc. And I'm very thankful to them for their support. If you're interested in supporting this channel like that, check the links below in the description. I'm on both GitHub sponsors and Patreon. And there's also a link to PayPal for one-time tips. And if you're not interested in supporting in that way, definitely just click like on this video and share it with people who you know might like it, so that we can get more people here on the channel to talk about cool stuff with us, especially on our live streams on Fridays. And if you want to talk to cool people in this community, check out, I think I have a link below in the description to our Discord server and IRC. We're there all the time talking about cool stuff, so definitely come join us. All right, so thanks so much for watching this video. Hopefully you liked it, and if you did, let me know. So until next time, thanks a lot. Happy hacking. We'll see you.